Hello and welcome to the Chapter 37, Section 3 lecture. In this lecture, we'll look at life during wartime during World War II. So for the first part, we'll look at the patterns of occupation. One of the things that takes place in this war is the powers who are conquering countries are then occupying them. Right? Japan is occupying the countries of East Asia, and in Europe, it's the German army. So Japan usually governs through puppet governments. In the Allied side of the war, they use military control, using the military after the war to control these territories. Germany in Northern Europe leaves the countries under German supervision. So they create puppet governments, or they allow the governments to continue to operate but under Nazi supervision and not allowing them to divert from the plans for the Nazis. But in Eastern Europe, it was more military control. And so what that means is that you have your army occupying that country's streets, and the soldiers are the authority, right? And that's what happened in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And then after the war, it's what happens in Korea and in Japan and in Germany. So the conquered states are exploited during the war. And as the Nazis were building their empire, they were using the countries they were conquering for their resources, but also for slave labor in factories. They conscripted labor, which means they forced people to work from areas in Poland, the Soviets, the people of the Balkan states, and then in the case of Japan, the Chinese and Koreans that they occupied were forced to work extracting resources, working in factories. So any type of heavy labor was forced by the occupying armies. And that picture in the middle is a very famous factory in Poland, in Krakow, and that's the factory of Oskar Schindler. So there was a very big movie about the Holocaust made back when I was in high school called Schindler's List. And if you've seen that one, it's made in black and white, but it's the story of Oskar Schindler, who used this factory to hire Jews, he bought them as slaves, but then he had them work in good conditions, and he didn't allow them to make any working weapons. So he wanted all his machines to be discalibrated so that his factory would actually be worthless in terms of creating weapons. But he was a member of the Nazi Party, but he saw what was happening to the Jews, so he used his factory as a way of saving people by buying them so that they wouldn't be sent to the death camps. So there was collaboration with occupying forces. So the Japanese dominated in East Asia, and there were a lot of people that cooperated because they gained posts in the new administrations. So if you want to think about it, think if somebody invaded the United States, they would have a lot of opposition, but there might be some Americans here who maybe, one, didn't really care a lot for the government, and two, maybe didn't have a good station in life, and now they feel like, hey, if I help work for the Germans, they might, treat me better. I might get more food. I might not get sent to slave labor camps, right? And so there was a lot of collaboration because of this. So anti-communism also led to some people joining the Nazi SS troops in countries of Eastern Europe who were afraid of the growth of influence of communism, saw the Nazis as anti-communist. So some of them joined in places like Hungary, in Greece and other countries. And then there was resistance to occupation. So there was active resistance. Active resistance is when you're fighting back, right? Sabotaging. Here you see a man ready to blow up a train track. Assassinations. There's a really good, there's a German, or it's a Danish film called Lemon and Citron. And it's about Danish police officers, who were forced to collaborate with the Nazis, but what they're really doing is they're working with an underground organization to try to assassinate some of the big Nazi shot callers that are in Denmark. So they have a list of people that they go over and they secretly, set up assassinations of Nazi officers who were in their country. And then there was passive resistance. Passive resistance is intelligence gathering, right? You're giving information and smuggling it out of the country to help the Allies, or refusing to submit. And then resistance to Japan was dangerous and it was rare. So you saw this happening more in the Nazi occupied areas, not so much in the Japanese occupied areas. And again, I mentioned in the previous lecture, there's lots of movies that deal with these time periods. There's a movie called Flowers of War that deals with the rape of Nanjing. And if any of you have seen the martial arts movie Ip Man and Ip Man 2, those take place during the Japanese occupation of China during the war. And you'll see examples of collaboration in there. So response to resistance, however, was atrocious. So they had brutal reprisals to people caught trying to resist. And this was done to make everyone else afraid, right? So even there was resistance within the concentration camps. There was the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. If you've seen the movie The Pianist, that's about the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And resistance grows throughout the war. In the Nazi camps, this often meant that people were punished. They were made to kill other people that were in the camps, or they killed them in front of everyone to show what happens if you resist. So they try to use them as examples. So it was very, very cruel the way resistance was treated. And then during the war and under the cover of war, the Germans carry out one of the most atrocious acts in history, which is the organization of the mass genocide known as the Holocaust. Now, there had been a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, dating back hundreds and hundreds of years. So anti-Jewish feelings, anti-Semitism was not new. But what it does is it creates a tolerance. Because it's centuries old, it created a tolerance of anti-Jewish measures. And the first people to sense the changing tide when the Nazis come to power, they were encouraged to leave Germany. They emigrated. Albert Einstein was a person who emigrated from Germany to the United States early on. And when the Nazis come to power, they create the Nuremberg laws that deprive the Jews of citizenship. And that chart you see there from the Nuremberg laws defines, purity of blood and what makes you a pure German and who are your grandparents. And so essentially you had to have like 8 ancestors, right? Great-grandparents had to all be German, non-Jew for you to be considered pure German. And so the Nazi conquest began to bring more Jews under Nazi control. Poland had a large Jewish population, and there were a lot of Jews that also lived in Russia and in other countries of Eastern Europe. And so as the Nazis are occupying Europe, there are now millions and millions of Jewish people under their control. And they begin to orchestrate a way of killing them. So for the Jews, it was this hatred that had developed that Hitler had promoted, right? And he wanted to kill them and make them erased from history, essentially. And that's why scholars of genocide, they call that stage of genocide extermination, because the way you treat the victims are the way you would treat rodents or an infestation, right, of trying to exterminate. And that's the way the Jews were treated and seen. And so this term was called the final solution. It comes from a conference that was held at Wannsee. And at the Wannsee conference, they come up with a plan to commit genocide, right? So it was they had this thing they called the Jewish question, right? Now that there are more Jews in our control, What do we do about the Jewish question? We need to find a final solution to the Jewish question. And so at this conference, this is where in this room, they orchestrate how they're going to kill millions of people. And it begins with the slaughtering of Jews, the Roma, the gypsy people of Eastern Europe, and other quote unquote undesirables as in the areas of the Soviet Union they had invaded. And in occupied areas in places like Poland and France and Denmark, the people were forced to live in ghettos, right? Segregated neighborhoods walled off from the rest of the society. That picture there is from the Wannsee conference, and then the photograph in the middle is of a list, right? So they would have people dedicated to finding how many Jews lived in each country, in each province, and they created a list here of 11 million as the targeted number of Jews to try to remove from their societies and eventually kill them. So at first they would use what were called Einsatzgruppen, and Einsatzgruppen are mobile killing units. And these mobile killing units would follow the soldiers into war, and after a city fell, these units would round up the Jewish population. They would go to local officials, they would get registries, they would find the names of the Jewish families, they would take them out to the edges of the city, they would make them dig mass graves, these giant ditches, and then they would execute them. So by the end of 1941, 1.4 million Jews had been killed. And then by 1942, the Nazis decided to evacuate all European Jews to camps that they were building in Poland. So they had concentration camps that they had built throughout Germany, like Dachau. And those were camps where the Nazis would send political prisoners and dissidents. They targeted homosexuals, they targeted people with disabilities, and they targeted people who were socialists and communists, Catholics, and then people who disagreed with Nazi policy, critics of the Nazis. And so at the Wannsee conference, and when they talk about the final solution, they were looking at the killing of Jews by the Einsatzgruppen as demoralizing to the soldiers, because you were forcing the soldiers to see so many people being killed in front of them and going numb to it. But they also talked about how bloody it was, right? It's like, okay, well, then we got to clean up the blood. And then if there's 11, how are we going to get that many bullets? So they started thinking of in terms of economic and cost savings. How do we save costs and save, it's tiring out the soldiers to carry this out. So they had to come up with a quote, final solution. And that's where they set up the death camps. And death camps are camps that were built specifically for killing. They weren't labor camps where people were making stuff for the war or for industry. Most of these were located in occupied Poland. And the largest ones were in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where over 1 million Jews were killed in this camp alone. So by the end of the war, Poland lost 90% of its Jewish population. And the cruelty was, right, to avoid resistance, you let people think it's a work camp, and as you enter the gates, it says Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free. In other words, if you come in here and you behave and you will work for your freedom. But there was never any intention to free them. This is where they built large gas chambers. The gas chamber, and I'll show you guys this in class when I see you in class. The gas chambers in Dachau were just small gas chambers. But the one in Auschwitz was meant to like usher in a big crowd of people and kill them all at once. That map you see is an aerial map of all the different bunkers and just the whole layout of the camp and how big that camp was. And every day trains would arrive with new prisoners to be gassed. And so there was, some Jewish resistance, but it was difficult to resist due to starvation and disease. The conditions they were kept in the ghettos made them very weak. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943 was the most successful attempt. 60,000 Jews rose up against the Nazis, and they held out for a few months until eventually the Nazis went in there and they bulldozed the ghetto and they evacuated the Jews to the death camps. So a approximately 11 million people were killed in the Holocaust. 5.7 were Jewish. I mentioned, the other populations of prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, gypsies, homosexuals, people with disability, political dissidents were among the other groups. What this did was it opened the world's eyes to the need for a Jewish homeland. At the end of the war, the American soldiers, what you see there is they're making a German woman march through the camp so she could see what her government had done. And when the world saw the level of organization of the Holocaust, it opened the eyes to the world that the Jews need a homeland for the Jewish people. And that's going to shape the politics of the Middle East coming out of the war. So in class, we'll talk a little bit more. You will have a writing looking at a DBQ type of assignment on the Holocaust. So other aspects of the war, as we shift away from the Holocaust, is how women were involved in the war. And in the section, It's a Woman's War Too, it talked about how over 500,000 British women joined the auxiliary service. And in the United States, they had what was called WAC, the Women's Auxiliary Corps. 350,000 American women joined the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Soviet and Chinese women took up arms in their countries. They were fighters. And then Jewish women and girls suffered as much as men in the camps. They weren't treated any differently from the men. So in the Auxiliary Corps, they worked as, note takers. They worked as relaying information, helping a lot with the logistics of the war. And then we saw the women taking over the men's jobs in the factories on the domestic front, right? Here's where the famous poster, the We Can Do It of Rosie the Riveter, right? And this begins to see a change in the role of women. Women take jobs. They had families. They become police officers. They become mechanics. They are working in the gun industries and the manufacturing industries. And so they gain more independence and they gain more confidence. And these changes were expected to be temporary. So if you ever go back and you try to go on YouTube and you find shows of the 1950s, like TV shows, they show the woman at home cooking and baking and cooking, and cleaning and having everything ready for the family. And that was not necessarily the reality of how women lived, but it was this desire to have women go back into the home, right? Go back to the cult of domesticity. A lot of those shows were meant to promote the return of women to the more traditional role. But this is the beginning of the movement and the thought processes that begin to lead to the feminist movements that we're going to see develop in the 1960s. And then in the occupied areas that Japan occupied, women were forced into prostitution. So 300,000 women were forcibly recruited by the Japanese. 80% of them came from Korea, and they called them comfort women. They were forced into prostitution, and so the Japanese soldiers would rape them, and then they would pay them, right, to try to say it wasn't rape. But these women had no choice. It wasn't. They weren't volunteering. They were forced into these brothels, and they served in military brothels that sometimes serviced 20 to 30 men a day. And then many were massacred, and then so survivors experienced a lot of shame. There was a lot of women that ended up pregnant, and they were women who had been married before, or now that they're pregnant and they had the child of some Japanese soldier who's going to want to marry them. They face a lot of shame in their home countries. And so this was another example of the Japanese atrocities that were taking place throughout Asia. And so that's the different ways that women were impacted, both on the home front and in the war. So in the next lecture, we'll look at the end of the war, and we'll look at the effects geopolitically of World War II.